Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, with a focus on the forgotten source of flooding, groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored, and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we are a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Katie Hargrave-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast I will be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding, and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation and strategies from the water sector, academia and beyond. As we face increasing flood risk, the way we engage with stakeholders is changing. More than ever, it's vital that communities are involved in the flood alleviation projects impacting their communities. Social value is moving from a buzzword in tenders and contracts to a guiding principle for authentic, collaborative engagement. With no established policy or legislation accepted across the industry, it's up to professionals to navigate the complexities of social value and embed it in their work. In this episode, we will be exploring what it means for projects in the built environment to be socially successful. What is social value? How can it be used to improve flood management projects? And what are the risks if it is ignored? Joining me today are Dr. Sarah Fitton and Simon Wilson. Sarah is the founder and director of Aurora Engagements, a consultancy helping clients engage meaningfully with stakeholders and identify, create, measure and communicate the social value of their projects. You may remember Sarah from our very first Groundwater Rising episode, where alongside Dr. Karen Potter, she helped me unravel the meaning of resilience. Simon is the co-founder and director of Wilson Sheriff, a consultancy focusing on providing facilitation and stakeholder engagement expertise to clients in a range of sectors, including the built environment. Their book, Socially Successful Projects in the Built Environment, Demystifying Social Value and Stakeholder Engagement, is due to be published in 2026. Simon, welcome to Groundwater Rising, and Sarah, welcome back.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
So, to start us off, I feel like social value is something we've heard about, but people don't always actually understand what it means. Me for one of them. Would one of you mind talking me through what social value is?
My simple explanation, and Sarah can say more, is that social value is about finding out what matters to people.
Perfect. It's really interesting the way Simon takes that, because I think, especially given that I've worked in social value for so long, when you do kind of start to look into social value, it is a really difficult and contested concept. So trying to get to the bottom of it can be quite hard. And if you Google what is social value, you come up with so many different definitions that it's really hard to pick what you want. Simon's completely right. It is just about what matters to people, and it's understanding what people need and then taking it from there to understand how you can meet those needs. So on a project, the social value would be whatever action or intervention you put in place to meet those needs of the community or the stakeholders.
Because you hear value and you're like, it's kind of something to do with money. So is it not always involving money, or is that just an occasional thing?
There's a lot of different tools in industry, especially in the built environment, to quantify the social value that is being delivered on projects, and even the government have got their own social value models so you can quantify it. But I think because social value is about, like what Simon was saying, in terms of, people's wants and needs, their likes, their dislikes, it's quite a subjective concept as well. So when you then drill it down and try and put a monetary value on it, it can become quite contested. In academia, that's kind of the biggest debate around social value as to, should it be quantified or should it not? Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? And I think in industry at the moment, we're kind of in that it can be qualitative and can be quantitative. I think if you drill it down just to financial or a monetary value, you lose a lot more of the richness of social value if you look at it from a qualitative perspective.
So if I think about where I live, what do I value about the place I live? I happen to be lucky enough to live in Matlock in Derbyshire, which is a great place to live. If I think about the value of the place, I probably think about things like property prices, but I also really value the natural environment around me. I value how the place looks and feels. I value the community. Derbyshire is a great place to live because everybody calls you Duck. I really value that sense of community. And I also value the sense of history about this place. So, going back to the really, really early lead mining activities, this has been a place where people have worked over hundreds of years. And so that very strong sense of history, but not about kings and queens, about people who work. If somebody was going to come along to Matlock and come up with some brilliant project to improve the town, those are some of the things that I value, and those are some of the things that I would want to see taken into account by the people planning that project.
And then would you want to somehow get involved, I guess, in the people planning that project?
So that's a really interesting question, because obviously some people like to get involved and some people don't. As much as anybody else, I quite like putting my feet up in front of a box set on a Thursday evening rather than going to a meeting in a drafty village hall. However, fundamentally, if you want to find out what people's social values are, you have to ask them. Even more importantly, you have to listen. And that does require some form of engagement. Some people will want to get involved. They can become really heavily involved in participating. And I think that makes for great projects. But you also have to recognise that other people have got other stuff going on in their lives. So part of this is also thinking about how do you engage in a way where you reach as many members in the community, as many different interests as you can, in ways that work for them.
I think that's one of the trickiest things of anyone who works in engagement is there are some people who love to get involved, some people who are very interested and very invested in their environment, in their surroundings, in their community, but they don't necessarily always agree with those who are less involved. So how do you go about kind of unpicking that? The people who like to speak the loudest, that's a good thing and a bad thing in some ways, but how do you find out from people who are a bit quieter?
In the traditional engagement with a lot of built environment projects and a lot of flood projects as well, you see the usual suspects when you do the engagement. And like you say, Katie, it's the ones that either have the biggest grudge to bear, or, they shout the loudest, or they're very, very heavily involved, which is great because you do need those, and they're usually the community champions, and they've usually got a lot of really useful knowledge. However, there is those people that either for whatever reason are a lot harder to reach or harder to engage with, or just don't have the time to be able to engage with you. But Simon and I found that actually the way that the traditional stakeholder engagement and community engagement process is set up, it doesn't really facilitate us to understand who those people are and how we change our engagement methods. That's when we started to kick back against the traditional influence interest matrix, which was very much about putting people in, certain boxes, but it was very project focused and not people focused. So we started to think, well, if we flip this and take a social value approach to our stakeholder mapping from the very beginning, then it will start to flip who we focus our time for engagement on. And then that allowed us then to direct a bit more time in understanding who those groups were and how we could engage with them. It's very much about just listening first and saying to everyone, how do you want to be engaged? And then taking that on board and not doing the traditional methods or, a one method fits all approach.
And it's a really helpful way, in practical terms, of addressing the issues around diversity. I think we all recognise the need for that. So by looking at varying how you engage, you can reach more diverse groups. If you've got people with childcare commitments, they're going to find it more difficult to engage at certain times of day, as will be the case for people who are away at work. As will be the case for teenagers or school kids or whatever. So you really need to be looking at those diverse ways of engaging. And then that enables you to ask them, and what matters to you? What do you value about where you live? And understanding the range and diversity of those social values is really important. If I'm really honest, I've been doing community engagement around flood projects for many, many years. And you do kind of recognise the usual suspects who turn up to a drop-in session in a village hall. You recognise them easily because they tend to look like me. They tend to be older white middle-class people, wherever you are. So how is it that you reach out to different groups? It means doing things differently. It means challenging your way of doing things and really, really listening to what matters to them.
And I think with flooding projects it's different because ultimately what people want is normally one thing, and that's not to flood. And there's always an element of that isn't as simple as it can be. Could flood projects be improved if they were focusing on not just flooding, but actually more than that?
I'd slightly challenge what you say there, Katie, in that from the perspective of somebody who's working on a flood project, what people are interested in is stopping the flooding. But we worked recently on a project where an organisation went out to engage a community around ways of stopping the flooding. Actually, flooding wasn't the most important priority to that community. There were other things that mattered more to them. The proposed scheme would have affected some of the areas like parks where people went every day. They were important for leisure. That's where their kids played. They were a bit sceptical about whether flooding was the most important thing. And of course, this also plays into factors like what have been the recent experiences of flooding. One of the interesting factors about this project, incidentally, was that groundwater was part of that discussion. And the community were not really persuaded that what was being proposed would deal with the groundwater issues, it would deal with the river flooding and so on. So actually we got into quite a complex discussion about what really mattered to that community. And the answer wasn't automatically that flooding was at the top of the list of priorities. It was important, but there were other things that mattered more. And this is where it becomes so difficult if it's your project. So your project is to go out and sort this problem. And then you come across members of a community who say, well, actually, there are other things that matter to us. And so coming round to the concept of a socially successful project, a socially successful project is one which really fully takes account of the different range of views which stakeholders bring into that project, and ideally is prepared to adapt and shift the project in response to those views.
You enter into one of those very complex situations where what if there's such differing views? So some people, flooding is not their main source of concern, but then groundwater can affect a smaller proportion of people. The wider community aren't going to say, oh, we want you to solve this flooding issue. So if you were coming at this from a social value perspective, how do you weigh the contrasting needs of the community?
It's really difficult, and I think this is where a lot of projects really struggle, because there isn't that much guidance either as to how you can do that. And I think this is where early engagement and that listening piece is really important, because it's about developing those relationships with your stakeholders. Because on every project, you're never going to make everyone happy. There's always going to have to be a compromise. And there's also going to be a compromise between the socially successful aspect and also the technical aspect as well. So it's balancing all those different factors, really. But I think by develop that relationship with stakeholders early, you can have those conversations and you can say, we can't do this, but we can do this. Could we compromise by this? Rather than just asking everyone what they want, leaving a really quiet period where no one knows what's going on, and then just creating a project and saying, ta-da, there we go, where only a few things have been incorporated, because that's really the only scope of the project. But that's when you get the kickback from communities that they're not happy because they haven't been taken on that journey. So I think early engagement and being open and honest, managing expectations, saying, we can do this, we can't do this, that's a great idea, or we really appreciate that view, but for this reason we can't do it. And I think Simon and I have found that taking that approach means that at the end, the project is usually accepted by all. It might not be loved by all, it might be loved by a few, but you haven't got that kickback because you've been open and honest and transparent throughout.
The one thing I'd add to that, Sarah, is it's really important for us, project members, to listen to what community members have to say. It's also about establishing a context in which they can listen to each other. So understanding those different issues and priorities can be really helpful. Now, sometimes that's really difficult. I mean, if anyone listening has ever worked with anglers and canoeists, looking at how do you use a watercourse, they are going to have different priorities. But an example of this is that very often the intervention which is proposed for managing floods takes place at a different place from where the benefit is felt. So in other words, there's an area that floods, but actually you're going to build something slightly further upstream, for instance. So it's really important that the people who are going to be disrupted by that build understand the effect of those floods on the community further downstream, that they listen to each other. So while I think we put a lot of emphasis on us as the project people finding the solution because we're really clever, there's also something about enabling communities and stakeholders to build understanding and find solutions together, which may, incidentally, not be quite the solutions that we thought of in the first place. So again, more listening and less talking is really important.
Yeah, and I like that idea of connecting communities, learning from each other, supporting each other. Like, that is probably like the gold star of engagement, is when you can do that. But I guess one of the other ones is that Working on FLOG projects, often when you bid for funding, you have to say what you're going to do. It's very difficult if you then go and do it and then everyone's like, but we don't want that, we want this. Is there something people can do if they know they want to bid into a fund before they've already gone out and done some initial engagement? But again, that also requires funding for lots of people.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why we wrote this book is that we believe that the traditional way in which projects are run is missing something important. Our view is that successful projects need to be technically feasible, financially viable, and also socially successful. But a lot of the project processes that in particular public sector organisations have to go through push you in the direction of defining a solution quite early on. And then you develop your outline business case and your business case and so on. What we keep encouraging people to do is, even before then, to go out and start listening to communities and stakeholders and allow them to help shape what your proposal is going to be. Now, there's a fundamental problem here, which is usually about budget. So have people actually got the time and the budget to do so? But there's an even more fundamental problem, which is people are reluctant to go out and engage people if they haven't got an answer. If you're an expert, you really like to go out and say to people, we've done loads and loads of analysis and here's our fabulous solution and we are revealing it to you. And it's actually quite difficult for people who are used to working in that way to go out to people and say, we've got a problem with flooding in our area. When we sort this out, what's going to matter to you? What ideas do you have? And then sitting back and listening. Because fundamentally it's that issue about engage early, listen, that is going to make the difference in that context.
I think there's a real focus, there has been for many years, on the technical and the economic aspects of projects, and they've been the measures of success and how well projects have been, and whether you're going to get more funding or whether you're going to get the next project. And that's why I think there's this, like Simon was saying, there's this real need to make sure that it's technically fine, and the social aspect is a nice to have or an add-on, and that's why it's never seen as the priority, which, as we know, can actually cause projects to fail spectacularly if the community aren't happy. So it's trying to flip our thinking really as an industry, which is hard when we've been doing things in a certain way for so long.
And in the summary of your book, it does say that there is no legislation, there is no policy guidance on social value. What do you think the impact of that is?
The impact of that is everyone's trying their best, but we're all trying in a different way. So there's no uniformity. And, on one project, social value could mean this, or they do it in a certain way. On another project, it could mean something else. You've got, I say bog standard, social value is not bog standard, but you've got this bog standard social value, which is what we probably traditionally see as social value as apprenticeships or local spend in the community, those kind of attributes of social value. But then what we see is the field evolving, but now we're seeing that actually social value isn't just a procurement aspect, it's actually right the way through the project, from the very inception or even pre-inception, pre-ideas, pre-design, right the way through to post-occupancy. What that looks like is very different from everyone else because we're still trying to understand what it is and what it means. So everyone's looking at social value, but in a different way, which means we get all these different outputs of what social value is. And also because we haven't got the policy or the legislation to define, how you do social value on a project, everyone does it in a different way, which leads to different things. So it's a bit of a scattergun field or industry at the moment, but at the same time it's really interesting and exciting because there are so many different ways of doing things. We are seeing it evolve and we are seeing new things coming out. So I think the industry will look very different in the next 15 years, just as it looked very different 15 years ago.
I mean, I have to say, because I'm less of a social value geek, I kind of land a bit more in the space of there's a real creative opportunity here. Really good practitioners who want to deliver great projects, if they get to grips with this idea of making the project socially successful, and to do that you need to know what matters to people, you've then got a lot of different options in terms of how you deliver it. Now, I know that there is then a problem about consistency, about evaluation and so on, but I think it's also quite a creative moment and a time where people can work on social value. And there's, even a further point, which is you don't ever have to use the words. You don't have to talk about social value. You can simply, as part of your project, make the case that you'll deliver a better project if you go with the grain of what communities want, if you involve communities early in decisions that affect them. You'll save time, you'll save money, you'll save hassle, and ideally you'll end up with better results. So I think there is a high-level strategic issue around we don't have a clear definition and set of standards, and we definitely should be developing them. But in the short term, I think there's lots of tactical opportunities.
So I think there's something I think Zoe said earlier that was about sort of how projects are set up and that they are much more with the technical. Do you think there's an element of that is skills gap, because it's been the technical people running these projects and suddenly social value has been brought in and they're told to do social value and they're just there a bit like, oh, this is a very new concept to me and one that I'm perfectly happy to talk to someone about groundwater flooding, but I don't necessarily know how to find out what they feel in that situation.
I think there's both a skills gap and fundamental undervaluing of the skills that are needed for this social dimension of projects. I always feel real sympathy for amazing technical experts who can do stuff that I have no idea of how to do in terms of designing technical solutions, who are then faced with an angry local community group on a wet Thursday evening because they haven't been given the skills to handle that. The bit that I'm less sympathetic about is that organisations, I think, undervalue those skills. Sometimes those types of skills are called soft skills, as though there's something sort of flabby and fluffy about them. And actually these skills are really hard. As somebody who has, on many occasions, stood up in front of angry community groups and, in evening conversations, that is not an easy thing to work through. And to move from that anger to involving a community in decisions which affect them is simply skilled work. I'd say actually there's a bit of a lag going on. It's very interesting that if you take a look at the most recent publications by the Association for Project Management, for instance, their books used to be all about here is a process to run through. There's now a lot about relationships, about governance, around stewardship. And all of those are areas where you can build important project skills. But at the moment, I think we're lagging behind. So we're valuing technical and financial skills more. We're undervaluing the social dimension. And as a result, we've got this lag. And people who don't really have those skills are being put in a position where they really need to demonstrate them. And that's not really fair on them.
There is this underappreciation of just how important the engagement skills are, but also how important they are to be included early in the project as well. A lot of the time, Simon and I find ourselves, especially on flood risk projects, being brought in later in the project when we have to sort something out. Whereas if we'd been there at the start, we could have maybe tried to mitigate some of the challenges that were brought about that we had to sort out. There's an element of making sure that the right skills are at the start of the project as well, and then valuing those skills right the way through. And also trying to upskill people, like Simon said, making sure that we're not putting people in a situation that they're uncomfortable in.
Maybe I could give an example about this. I worked a while ago on a project where there was a need to develop a water treatment solution in a small isolated village. And the team went in and they developed some amazing innovative thinking about how they were going to do this. So instead of a traditional water treatment plant with pumps and machinery, they came up with this brilliant idea of what was called a passive solution, which would be much, much better suited to the local environment. And the technical expert went out to the local community full of pride and said, we've thought about this problem, we've come up with this solution, and we think it's amazing. And the community absolutely rebelled. They hated it, the whole thing. They didn't agree that there was a problem. They didn't see why the water needed to be treated because they'd had this issue with the water quality for about 75 years. They didn't want any disruption in their village, and they didn't trust this brilliant innovative solution because it was new and innovative and it had never been done before. And in the end, the protest from the community was so strong that the project had to be postponed for more than a year. And that obviously cost a huge amount in terms of money, in terms of staff time, in terms of disruption. Now, the consultant who went out and spoke to the community did so with good faith. He was basing this on his technical understanding. Whereas if from the beginning there had been a conversation with the local community saying, what do you feel about the water in your area? How do you feel about the water pollution? How much does that matter to you? What are the issues that concern you? What else matters about where you live? They'd have been able to get a conversation going which would probably have led to a similar type of solution, but one where you work with the grain of the community. The interesting thing about that project was after many years of quite difficult engagement, the project team gave the community a say in where the water treatment plant was going to be sited. And the community chose a different place from where the project team had originally thought it should go. And when I spoke to the project lead about a year after that, I said, so what do you think about that decision? What do you think about what the community did? And he said, it was a much better result. As a result of that consultation, we ended up with a better result. So what you can do by effective use of these skills is to save time, money, hassle, disruption, work with the grain of communities, but also end up with technically better results. That's our pitch about socially successful projects.
It's a very good one. And I think it'll ring true to a lot of people who've come up with what they think is the most brilliant idea. They're like, how could they possibly? They're going to love us. This is going to be great. And then they go in and they're just not wanted. Because like you said, they don't necessarily need that unless it's something they've been actively calling for. Suddenly having this thrown at them, it's just not necessarily what they wanted. But quite shocking, I think, for some. So to bring this back to flooding, I know that you went and did a workshop at Flood & Coast this year to do with socially successful projects and bring that into the flood world. Can you tell me a little bit about what you spoke about with flood professionals and how that workshop went?
We basically talked about what we've talked about here, this need to flip our approach to projects and balance the technical and the financial with the social as well, and make sure that we're really bringing that social dimension. But it was really interesting because we also talked about what some of the challenges were as well, because, I think probably a lot of people listening to this will say, in theory, this all sounds great, but why aren't we doing it in practice? And I think that's because there was quite a lot of barriers as well. At the workshop, it was great to discuss and get some really practical insight from those people that are working on the ground with these flooding communities as to why they find engagement sometimes difficult or why they're not able to do it at a certain stage in the project and that type of thing.
Do you remember any of the barriers that were coming up?
A big one was time. It was just the time and the resources available to invest in early engagement, upfront engagement, and then continuous engagement. In a lot of projects, people were saying that they only get a small budget for engagement, and that's not usually throughout the life of the project. There's usually a certain amount of days or, for an engagement professional. So that was a big one in terms of just having the time to be able to engage with people. Linked to that, obviously funding. A lot of projects don't have the funds to do engagement to that extent.
There's also something about the way that projects are structured, in that I think there's this sense that quite often the social aspects, the engagement aspects, are seen as a bit of an afterthought. And the main action is in the technical development, the budgetary processes and so on. So whatever your governing group is, your project board, your programme board, is not really tracking the social objectives of the project. They tend to sort of come up, when they come up as awkward incidents or events, but it's not really well integrated into the way in which projects are managed. I think there's another interesting thing, building on what you were saying, Sarah, about time, which is, I think there is this belief that if you invest time up front, you're going to slow down your project. And this is, if I'm really honest, connected in some places to some very patronising opinions about communities. Every now and then you hear phrases like NIMBYs. There's this sense that communities will try to block things out of self-interest. Now, of course, it's true that that sometimes happens, but our experience is that if you invest sensibly in engagement up front, it actually enables you to move more quickly further down the track with your project and actually save hassle, delay, resistance from communities because you've involved them from the start. And that, I think, is quite a difficult thing to get across. I think that engagement professionals probably buy that and understand that. But I think it's a difficult message to get across to other project professionals.
Do you think there's a fear of not being able to adequately map the timeline of a project if you're considering the engagement aspects? Because you can't really enforce the community to come back to you within a very short deadline. And so to try and create a timeline when you know that you want to do very significant community engagement is probably not actually that easy.
Yeah, definitely. I think the uncertainty of stakeholder engagement and working with communities for maybe the more technical professionals is quite unnerving because, they're probably used to their set processes and, model, especially in the flood industry, you've got your models and everything like that people work to, and that guides how you develop the project. Whereas with stakeholder engagement, you don't know what you're going to get from one engagement event to another. And I think for people like Simon and I, we thrive off that and we love that. But I think when people aren't used to working in this industry, that uncertainty of not knowing, what the community are going to throw at you is quite unnerving, and I think that makes people take a step back, definitely. I mean, just an example, I worked on a project where we had a community panel involved from the very beginning for a development in a city centre. What we did was we knew we wanted to collaborate and develop the project collaboratively, so we had a series of meetings with the community panel, and at each stage we told them what we were thinking, and they helped to shape and revise our plans and our proposals. But what we did before we even were commissioned, we built some time into our budget and our programme because we knew we would need to do some kind of work after those panels, because we were kind of certain that the community weren't just going to say, yeah, that's great, move on. So we knew there was going to have to be some kind of revision, some additional work done. Now, again, we were just lucky that we guessed the right amount of time that was needed. But yeah, I think it can be unnerving and difficult for people to deal with that uncertainty. But that uncertainty can open some really amazing creative spaces from which things develop and stuff like that, which you can't really even predict when you start your project. So it's having that trust that it's all going to be all right in the end.
And your book, is it going to be more of a practical guide or more discussion like we've had today? How is that going to be able to help people?
The book is in two parts. We've got the theory behind stakeholder engagement and social value, three aspects of a project in terms of the social, technical and the economic. And then in the second half of the book, we've got practical guidance as to how you engage with stakeholders, how activities such as optioneering can help to bring out what those communities want and how you can start to identify, the social value in whatever guise that may be. We've got quite a few case studies in there, practical real life case studies to show how you overcome certain things, or we've even got a few case studies where things didn't really go right and how we help to change it.
And then we also have this chapter which is around project lifetime, because of course one of the terrible things about projects is you've built this fantastic thing and the project team then walk away, and it's the people who live there who have to live with that project. So what is the lifetime of that project like, and how do you continue engaging over a period of time so that it becomes, dare I say it, a loved community asset rather than something which people are grumpy about? And one fantastic example of this was we talked over a period of time to a tidal flooding project down on the south coast in England. And it had been a very controversial project and had involved a lot of community engagement, but the organisations working on it had really stuck with it. And what they'd ended up with, in part, was a set of floodgates which you close when a tidal surge is predicted. And the problem with that is, of course, it then restricts access to the harbour and the beach and so on, so it's inconvenient for the local community. Now, those floodgates are operated by a group of community volunteers. And so I spoke to the volunteer lead from this project, and he said, these gates don't belong to anybody else. These are our gates. And so there was this sense of community ownership. And so he and his team would go out, they'd close the floodgates, but they'd also talk to people locally and explain, this is why we're doing it. We're doing it now, even before there's any flooding, because we want to make sure that we're protecting the local area. And then when they opened the gates, they would also chat to people. He did also mention there was quite a lot of socialising in the pub with this team. So it obviously had its own social value. But there was something here about, here was an asset where there was a real sense of community ownership over a period of years. Now, you can't always achieve that, but I think there's something about, as you walk down the street in your town and you see the flood wall which has been built, you see the landscaped park which now fills with water when a flood happens, do you think, that was a terrible thing? Or do you think, actually, this is something which is keeping us safe and is part of what it means to live in our community? And that's really the objective that you're looking for from a socially successful project.
Yeah, I think there's something really special about the community running it itself. I can already imagine living that community and being like, that's ours, that very quickly, and talking about it in the pub. It's the best way, and I think it's something that professionals can't really just go to pubs and talk to people. Somehow it's frowned upon, although it would work well, I think, but maybe not. If anyone else wants to go and find out more, do you know anything about when the book's coming out? How can people go find out about that and keep an eye out?
It's with the publisher at the moment. They are targeting a March 2026 publication date, but we have got a website, sociallysuccessfulprojects.co.uk. There'll be a link to buy it there as well, if everyone's interested.
Perfect. We'll add that to the episode notes so everyone can easily find it. Well then, Sarah and Simon, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. Please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising? Or would you like to join me to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. That's all for now. We will be back on the last Thursday of next month with another episode of Groundwater Rising.